Well, good afternoon, Vince and Kara. Thanks for joining live for this session. And if you're watching the recording later, this is the fourth and final of our gift planning bootcamp series for this summer. And today we are going to be talking about retirement a bit and how you can plan to give to Moravian causes in retirement and afterwards. So I joked last night with Vince that the title of this session should be "Don't Retire," because then you have to think about what comes after retirement. And that can be hard to think about and plan for. We're going to talk about that a little bit in today's session because I think it's appropriate. So what we're going to go through in this session of our boot camp is, the concerns you have usually when you retire or start thinking about retirement is, first off, will you have enough money? And then you have to think about, again, getting at what's after retirement is how do you transfer your property, your assets to kids, other family members down the road? Do you make plans for transfers of property? In that vein, do you make plans for care and support of dependent children? Usually we don't talk about that in the context of retiring individuals. But there can also be special causes that come into play. And what we're seeing as a result of the past 18 months is people are retiring earlier. So sometimes it's still an issue and concern. Do you have appropriate directives in place, both for physicians and families? We'll talk about that. And giving with outrageous generosity. I think the most important part of being blessed with anything is being able to make plans to give it to the charities that you're passionate about, and certainly in the case of the church. So the little guy here on this screen, so we love the little guy and he's dancing to his beat. He actually reminds me of one of my uncles. And if you see him off of his farm, he's always got a towel. But he's 93 and he is my example for what I want to live like as I age and as I retire, because he still works every day, stays very active, and is busy constantly. But this little guy reminded me of him a little bit. So you'll see him show up again on the next slide. So we're going to talk about, will you have enough money to retire? There's a famous quote out there with John D. Rockefeller, who of course was the patriarch of the Rockefeller family, started Standard Oil around the turn of the century. And he was asked one time, how much money is enough? Paraphrasing that question a bit, but his answer was just one more dollar. So again, when you start looking at retirement, how do you know if you've got enough money saved? The days of just being able to live off a pension that your company that you worked for 30, 40, 50 years provides for you, those are faded into the background in a big way. And in most cases now, people have to save something for retirement or become totally reliant on Social Security. So how do you know if you have enough money saved? This is a very individual conversation. It's based solely on facts and circumstances with individuals or couples, sometimes in a relationship. It can also be based on family situations and so forth. So I would encourage everybody, regardless of your resources, to use professional advisors to help. A lot of times you can do this at no cost to you. So why wouldn't you engage professionals to help with that? Attorneys certainly charge a fee. I tell people all the time with documents and things like that, sometimes you can have a pretty good draft together and then go to your attorney. You can minimize costs that way, but always with legal documents, have an attorney look at it at the very least, if not do it from scratch. Brokers, financial advisors, financial planners, all in that umbrella. These are people that can run projections for you, that can look at your individual circumstances, how much insurance you have, how much you saved in your 401k or other type of IRA, something like that for retirement. They can take your assets into consideration. What debts do you have? And actually run projections on how much money you will need in retirement. And again, many of those folks do that for free. They do that under the hope that you'll put some business with them. But again, they do that at no cost to you. And it's important, even if you're listening to this call and you're 20 And retirement is so far into the future, you can't think about it. Still, it's important to know what you're shooting for. And it's important to set expectations on, are you saving enough even now for retirement? And certainly as you get closer to retirement, do you have enough there to live on and basically survive in your lifestyle that you're going to have in retirement? So if you're planning to retire and travel a lot, certainly travel is not cheap. You got to plan for those things, healthcare costs, et cetera. All of that comes into play in planning for retirement. So again, tax professionals, accountants, same advice. They can help you a lot dealing with your assets and other types of plans. Make financial planning an active thing. It's not a once and done thing. You've got to check in periodically on that. You want to maintain financial stability when you retire. Maybe you've been invested totally in the equity market. You need to rethink that going into retirement because you want your assets a little bit more secure. And again, anticipate expenses. Part of that has to do with changing laws. You can never guess what Congress is going to do. So trying to have professional advisors engaged that when there are changes, they let you know that so you can factor that into your plans. And make your money work for you. Our little guy's showing up again at the bottom of the screen. He's kind of holding his money with an open hand like he's giving it away. You've worked hard for your money, you've worked hard for your assets, and you should make that work for you. You've earned it. So make sure these advisors are helping you do that. We have certain advisors that we work with and certainly can provide referrals to folks, to somebody in your area. We also have many Moravians that do this type of work that can help with the planning piece as well. So, why is planning important? This graph illustrates a big number in orange, $96 trillion. And that's the wealth in America. It's actually higher than that. This number is a few years old now. But the main part is the little line graph at the top, 2028 to 2054. So we're primarily talking about baby boomers. And not to scare any of you if you're in that category, but between those years, essentially at least 8,500 people per day are going to be entering the more immediate presence of our Savior, or going to a place that's a lot hotter that we don't like to talk about. But, you know, when all these people pass away, have they made plans? Have they given thought to what they want to have happen to what they leave behind? It's important to do planning so you control that, not the local magistrate or court or state law. You want to be able to control that yourself. So it is important to note on this slide that 96 trillion, only 1% of that is basically cash assets. Russell James does a lot of research into estates and kind of the stuff we don't like to talk about, death and dying and what happens to assets, et cetera. And he estimated that only 1% is in cash. So again, it's in real estate, retirement plans, IRAs, qualified plans, equities. That also touches on why you need professional advisors to help with these things. Some of these assets are difficult to transfer, difficult to liquidate in some cases, so you want to have that professional advice involved. The bottom of the slide notes that by 2028, 52 trillion will be in the hands of the baby boomer generation. We're very fortunate that we have a lot of our silent generation folks, kind of the people born prior to the end of World War II, still with us. But again, by 2028, a lot of that wealth is going to be in the hands of the baby boomers. So as we get to our second point on the slide, transfers of property. So, you know, you've worked hard, you've got all this wealth, even if you only own the clothes on your back, how do you transfer that to somebody else? And then how do you avoid people from fighting over it? It's kind of interesting, but people do fight over anything these days. And certainly they will do that a lot when someone passes away. So transferring assets on this slide, this kind of points to the areas you've got to consider when you talk about transferring property. So again, as I said earlier, when you retire, it's important to also think about what comes next. And none of us live forever. Certainly in a Christian aspect, we have a hope of eternal life with our Savior. But we also need to make plans for what happens when we are gone. So things like beneficiary designations. So if you have a retirement plan or you have life insurance, do you have those beneficiaries documented? Very important to make sure you do. Make sure it's still the person that you want it to be. All the ex-wives or ex-husbands out there would still love to get the life insurance and benefit from those retirement plans. So it's important to check into these periodically and make sure you have those updated and it's still your wishes today like it was 5 years ago or whenever you did it before. Transfer on death, we're going to talk about a little bit on the following slides, so we'll hit on that. Do you know what the laws are where you live, in the states you live? Do you know what's required in terms of filings, recordings, deeds, notaries, all that stuff? Make sure you're following those rules. Again, it's important to have professional advice to help you with that. And how are the assets titled? Do you have anything in a trust, and have you factored those considerations in? Should you have something in a trust? And again, that's where you really need that legal advice for those types of assets as well. So entering the more immediate presence of the Lord without a will. I touched on this earlier, but Jesus in John's gospel says he is the way, the truth, and the life. We love to dwell on that as Christians, and it's very important that we do. But also, it's great to have a hope of heaven. We're out of here when it's our time. But what happens to what we leave behind, and have we left a mess? So what happens if you pass on without a will? And this slide touches on some of that. And I'm going to go through specific examples with what happens in our state, North Carolina. Every jurisdiction is very different. It's important to know what happens in your own state or locality as well. 62% of Americans do not have a will. This is not, the majority don't have a will right now. So this is an important thing to be talking about. And it is important, if you don't have a will, that you have a trust or something else to control your assets. LegalZoom did a 2020 survey, essentially, that pointed to that 20 or 62% number. So that has actually gotten better in the last 18 months. A lot of people have said, wait, we need to have our financial affairs in order just because of what we've seen with COVID. If you have all the documents you're supposed to have, does somebody even know where those are? That's important too. So even you could have everything done perfectly and organized, you've got a plan, but does somebody know the plan, and do they know where the documents are? So don't forget the basics. Does somebody know where your passwords are to all your accounts, that kind of thing? It's important that you share that information with important people in your life. So provisions in North Carolina's law, if you die without a will, it's called dying intestate. And some of the provisions that are with the intestate laws in each state are kind of surprising. So just to point out a few of those examples with you. And I've done this in a church before where we actually have characters come up and play the role. It's a lot of fun when you have somebody come up and play the mother-in-law. Bishop Sapp actually did that one time with me at Calvary. It is a lot of fun, but it also points out, what happens if you don't have this plan and have it documented like you would want. So if you have a spouse and one child, and you pass away without a will, what do you think happens? Vince, what do you think happens? You have a child.
If you've named your wife as your beneficiary, she would get everything.
Yeah, if you have a designated beneficiary set up, right, and you've named her in your retirement, your life insurance, she would get all of that. But unless you have a will, that's not the case with other assets, including real estate and personal property. So In North Carolina, the way the law works, your spouse receives the first 30,000 of personal property. And the remaining personal property and real estate split evenly between your spouse and children. That kind of works the same way if you have multiple children. That was specific to one child, but it kind of gets split if there are multiple children. What about if you have a spouse and your parents are still living and you die without a will? Kara, what do you think happens in that case? You die without a will, you have a spouse, but your parents are also living.
It goes to your spouse.
It goes to your spouse. That's what most people think. You know, surviving spouse, I just hope the relationship's good with the in-laws. Because it's actually in that case, in North Carolina, the spouse receives the first $50,000 worth of personal property. The remaining personal property and real estate are split evenly between the spouse and the parents. So no family problems or drama could ever come into play with that.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, right. Exactly. What about if you die without a will, you're not married, you don't have any children, and your parents have already gone into the immediate presence of the Lord? What happens then? That's a scary one, because then the state decides what happens with everything, and it really goes to your next of kin to fight over, and can go pretty far down the family tree to get those assets back. If they can't find anybody, then the assets are escheated or essentially given over to the state. So again, if you want to have some direction, you want to be able to control what happens with your stuff, it's best to do that with designated beneficiaries, not only on the accounts we've talked about already, but also on bank accounts, checking, savings accounts, simple stuff like that. Have that documented. Have a will that definitely talks about the other stuff, and then you can control what happens to your assets. And that factor is not just for people that retire, but really anyone needs to have those kind of documents in order. All right. Avoiding disputes. Again, we've referenced this already. People like to fight over money and stuff. So if you have your plans documented, it's really your last gift, your last blessing to your family members when you pass away. It's important to have professional trustees when possible, to have an executor that knows what they're doing, or appointed administrator to handle your affairs. Have a durable power of attorney. So if you start to not be able to function mentally or physically, for that matter, you have somebody that can make financial decisions for you. The durable power of attorney is just financial matters. They can't change your will. They can't direct your causes or money for you, other than to pay your bills and handle financial transactions. We're going to talk about directives on a future slide, really around healthcare directives. Durable power of attorney is one directive as well. Make sure you have that in place. Do you need a trust to handle asset distributions? Do you have heirs, children, whoever, that maybe are not financially responsible? You want to control what happens to those. That's where you would use a trust. And are you able to control what happens to your assets? Again, having it documented and having the proper plans in place are extremely important. All right, care and supportive dependents. We're going to talk briefly about this. Again, we have a little guy on the slide here in front of us, so definitely that's why parents of any age need to think about a will. But this is also applies to grandparents. Again, we're seeing people retire early, so you could retire and still have children you need to make arrangements for if something happens to you. So you have to think about having a guardian in place, custodian in place for your children. Are you going to provide them with financial support? Document your intentions. You can do all of that really in a will, last will and testament. secure, responsible management of the people and things that are important to you, and have a trustee that you trust in place to handle these things. This is important, again, not only for children of young parents. Sometimes there are parents that have children with special needs that have special considerations also under laws everywhere, whether it be Medicaid or other things that need to be considered. You need to think about their support when you're not around to handle that support directly. And then maybe your children are grown, have families of their own. What kind of support do you want to give them into the future? And what of your assets do you want to leave to them? Again, have that documented and in place. All right, the fourth bullet in our presentation is directives for physicians and families. Do you have a living will and healthcare power of attorney? These have gotten a lot of attention in the past 18 months, but do you have this in place? A living will basically documents how you're cared for, what level of care you get when you can't make that decision yourself. For example, do you want to be on life support if that's an option to keep you alive? Do you want doctors to do everything to try to protect your life, and at what level and to what extreme? That's all documented in a living will. Healthcare power of attorney is actually who can make healthcare decisions for you when you can't make those yourself. Who is the person that you trust to step in and be your voice when you can't have one? That's the healthcare power of attorney. At MMFA, we actually have a document that qualifies in all the states that we have churches to really be those two things, living will, healthcare power of attorney. It's called 5 Wishes, walks you through documenting this. And once you fill out this document, you have a valid living will and healthcare power of attorney. Depending on what jurisdiction you're in, you may have to have it notarized. In North Carolina, you do. So make sure you follow those rules. We're happy to share this with anybody. You can email myself or Vince or any of our staff to get a copy of this, and we'd love to have you use that to ensure you have that in place. And no offense to our attorney friends that may be listening to this, but it's also a free solution for you versus having to pay an attorney to draft these documents for you. Very important to have these two things in place, especially with what we've seen in the past year. So many people have been, forced to, because of COVID, to have to, be in some healthcare decision making that they didn't want to be a part of, and that is certainly why it's important to have these in place in case you can't make those decisions yourself. All right, last but certainly not least in our list today is giving with outrageous generosity. So when you've worked your entire life, you have a nest egg built up to live on and protect your family and provide you with the things you need and want to do in retirement. If you can check yes to all those boxes, that's great. But we also want you to think about, how are you giving back? Again, once you retire, a lot of times you have less income. So that means you can't tithe at the level you did before, or you maybe can't be as generous as you have been in the past. Or maybe if you're totally free of debt, maybe you can be more generous. That's always a possibility as well. So people, as they get into retirement later in life, they think about these decisions. And certainly people have given to the church throughout their life. Why wouldn't you think about giving, even in retirement and from beyond the grave, how you give and support the churches and ministries that are important to you? So you can use charitable tools as part of that. And there are some great charitable tools to help not only in the build up to retirement, but afterwards. And I've listed 2 on this slide. In our very first session, we went into these probably in a little too much detail, but we talked about the charitable gift annuity and charitable remainder trust. These are great solutions for retirement planning that give you an income in retirement, but also give a balance in the future to the church or ministry that you love and that's dear to your heart. And sometimes a combination of both or all of those. So gift annuity and a charitable trust, particularly the flip charitable remainder trust is a great planning tool because you can contribute to that while you're still working. You can use that almost as a retirement account and then have that flip or triggering event be the date of retirement. And you can start getting that percentage payout. You can usually boost your income pretty significantly in retirement with that. And much like the gift annuity, the balance that's left passes to charity when you enter the more immediate presence. Great tools. If you want to learn more about either one of those tools, I encourage you to go back and watch our very first boot camp session this summer that's on split interest gifts, and you'll hear more about both of those, or reach out to the foundation. We're happy to help and share more detail. So I don't want to leave without, in outrageous generosity without talking also about the IRA. IRAs are an important planning tool. In 2017, 32% of the retirement assets in the United States were in an IRA. IRA stands for Individual Retirement Account. Last year, almost $20 trillion was tied up in IRA accounts. So it's important that people understand what they have when they have an IRA, but also understand how to use it. So the QCD is a great way to use your IRA to give back to your church or agency of choice. It's called QCD, Qualified Charitable Distribution. What happens with the Qualified Charitable Distribution, there's some rules around that. So you have to be at least 70 and a half to withdraw money for this from your IRA. And the beauty of it is you have your custodian or whoever controls your IRA account transfer that money directly to your church or your favorite agency, and you don't have to recognize the income from that. You don't get a charitable deduction, but you don't recognize the income from that. So it is a great way to give to charity. If you don't need all the income from your IRA, certainly you can use this method to give money to your churches. The age trigger for a qualified charitable distribution is still 70 and a half. That's a little confusing because you don't have to take distributions now from your IRA until you're 72. But the qualifier for that QCD is 70 and a half. There are a lot of rules around the qualified charitable distribution. You have to be the IRA owner, IRA creator. This can't be done from an inherited IRA. You also cannot do it if you're below that 70 and a half age. So it's important that you be aware of what those rules are and how to use it. But it's a great planning tool to give back to your church. Talk to people all the time that say they've set theirs up just to do their tithe every year. It's a great use of that because it keeps your income lower and still supports the church or agency you love. It's important with IRAs too to talk a little bit about some changes that happened in 2019. I know all of us would like to forget some things that happened in 2019 and some things that happened in 2020 for that matter. But the SECURE Act was passed at the end of 2019. SECURE stands for Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement. It changed the required minimum distribution rules. So the federal government does make you take distributions from IRAs, but now you don't have to do that until you're 72. Used to be the year after you turn 70 and a half. Now it's after your 72nd birthday. So they moved it up a little bit. They also changed the rules around contributions. Historically, you couldn't make contributions after you reach that mandatory distribution age. That's not the case now. You can still make contributions to a traditional IRA above 70 and a half as long as you're still working. And the reason Congress did that is people are working longer. They wanted to be able to save more toward retirement and kind of put money away for the future. They can do that. Roth IRA has never had an age limit, so it really didn't change that for Roths, but for traditional IRAs, you can now contribute as long as you're working regardless of your age. That was a cool change to these rules. Now we're getting into what some people view as the negative changes by the SECURE Act. The stretch IRA is dead. And what I mean by stretch IRA, historically, you could leave your IRA to your children and they could withdraw from the IRA over their lifetime. So it was called stretching it over multiple lifetimes. The service and Congress did away with that and said you can't stretch the IRA anymore. So when an individual passes away, if they leave their IRA to children or anybody other than their spouse, there are different rules that kick in now, but in most cases, the IRA has to be fully withdrawn within 10 years and taxes paid within that 10-year span as well. And that's the reason Congress made that change. They want the tax revenue to support largely the tax cuts that went in 2017, other things that happened in 2019. And they're using the tax revenue or projected tax revenue from those IRAs to pay for that. So again, taxes have to be paid in 10 years. They want their tax money. And it's ordinary income tax. And again, it forces people to withdraw the money whether they need to or not. So again, qualifications for that, you get into something called designated and eligible beneficiaries. Eligible designated beneficiaries. And the folks that are eligible designated beneficiaries don't have to apply to that 10-year rule. That doesn't apply to them. So that would mean, you know, you're eligible, your spouse is an eligible designated beneficiary. Any minor children, at least for the years they're under 18, would not have to fully withdraw the IRA. Anybody that's critically ill as a beneficiary, you wouldn't have to follow that 10-year rule. And if the beneficiary is more than 10 years younger than the person who left the IRA or the decedent, they don't have to follow that 10-year rule as well. Again, a lot of very specific rules around this stuff. You have to worry about if the surviving spouse inherits it and then they put it into their IRA, the 10-year rule kicks in and they no longer are an eligible designated beneficiary. So a great planning tool if you want to extend the life of your IRA and support your church or favorite ministry is to leave a charitable remainder trust as the beneficiary of your IRA. You know, the charitable trust doesn't pay taxes, so the IRA would go in, assets would go into the charitable trust. Then you could name your children, your friends, or whoever as beneficiaries of that, and they would then get payments over their lifetime and not be subjected to being forced to draw it out within that 10-year period. So it's a great planning tool. The beauty of it too is at the end of your beneficiary's lifetime, those assets would then go to charity or the ministry of your choice, which is a great use of the IRA and also a little bit of a way around having to pay that huge tax bill to the IRS as those assets are withdrawn. Great planning tool with the IRA. If you've got questions about that or would love to look at what that means for you, please reach out to our foundation. We're happy to help. All right. I've talked a lot. What questions are there? Vince, Kara, you guys have any questions? I'm seeing a negative. Vince is just back against the brick wall. And it's all good. All right. If you're listening to the recording of this, this is our last session. So if you'd like to see the previous sessions, I'd ask you to visit our website. We have all the recordings posted out there, and you can go back and watch not only the gift planning bootcamp sessions, but also our investment sessions that we did earlier in the summer. I encourage you to do that. Give us your feedback. Is it important to have training sessions like this in your church so people understand maybe what they should do with retirement assets and how that could help your church? It certainly is. So please ask us about that. We're willing to do a session like this or anything for individual churches or groups at any time. So thanks for listening, and everybody have a great day.